All right, so this week I'm going to be talking in keeping with the theme of talking about some common types of scenarios that you're likely to encounter and be asked for help with. Today I'm going to be talking about rashes and eruptions on the skin. So I'm not so much talking about some of the more long-lasting or majorly pathological skin issues that can happen, but more just some things that are not necessarily serious and are fairly self-limiting, the sorts of things that wouldn't kill you even if you didn't do anything about them and would probably go away on their own, but that are nevertheless a common thing for people to seek treatment for, and just sort of more of a part of life than a disease, really. So, the skin is it has the largest surface area of, largest exposure to the environment of any organ, and it's got it comes in direct contact, as compared to, say, the lungs or the sinuses or something like that. It's coming in direct, unfiltered contact with a lot of things in the environment that are not always good for it. So sometimes the skin has reactions to those things that can be inflammatory reactions, or they can be responses to infection, and often responses to infection involve inflammation as well. But for instance, there are rashes that are not infectious in nature, that are just sort of, you come into contact with something, maybe you have an allergic reaction to it or something like that, and that's an inflammatory response. And then there are also things like, say, ringworm or cold sores that are a response to some sort of infection of the skin. Now, if any of these things becomes very serious, then it might not be a good do-it-yourself project, might not be a good thing to take care of at home or whatever. But most of the time they're not. Most of the time, even if they're very annoying or very painful, these aren't exactly things that are far outside of the realm of common human experience. Like if you get poison ivy all over your body, that's miserable. But it is something that you can reasonably work with at home, work with yourself without having a lot of experience, or help someone else with without having a whole lot of experience, because there are some simple things you can do to help with it. The same is true of acne. Acne is not really considered a disease because most people experience it at some stage in their life, but it is unpleasant, and it causes a lot of people stress and anxiety because of the way it looks, and it can be painful and all that. So, and that's just speaking of regular acne. There is cystic acne, which is like deeper into the skin and involves more damage and things like that. But most acne is just basic pimples breaking out on the skin and that sort of thing. So that's like I said, not really considered a disease, just considered a part of life, more or less, for most people. Not everybody, but for most people. So we're going to be talking about some of those sorts of things and some general strategies for dealing with issues with the skin, and for trying to support the skin and help it to heal in these types of situations. And I'm going to talk about, some individual different situations and what we would do in them. But overall, here's a strategy for most skin issues, which is that you work on reducing inflammation, you work on treating infection if you believe any is present, helping the body to get rid of the infection if you believe that any is present, and you work on soothing and tightening the tissue of the skin itself. So that's sort of a broad approach that works with, if you did that with every skin issue that showed up, it would almost always work. This could include anti-inflammatory compounds for the inflammation. It could include cleansing and antiseptic compounds topically for any sorts of fungal, bacterial, viral things that might be going on the skin. And it could include astringents and emollients, astringents to firm up the tissue, emollients to soothe it. So those are some categories of herbs that we might be using to deal with skin issues of various different sorts. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a sunburn. Lots of people have experienced sunburns. Generally speaking, the lighter colored your skin is, the faster you burn when you're out in the sun. There are some people who that doesn't seem to apply to, but for the most part, that's how it goes. And what's really going on in that situation is that the energy from the sun is cooking the proteins in your skin, and then that's not very noticeable. You're just hot. Usually you're out in it. You might not even realize you've gotten a sunburn at first. But then these proteins that have been altered by heating and by being essentially irradiated by the sun, so these proteins have been altered, so they're no longer the normal proteins that would be in those places, and then your body has an immune response to those proteins to try and destroy them because it doesn't recognize them as normal proteins. And so you have a big inflammatory response all over the area that has been cooked, that has had the proteins changed. And this process of proteins changing in response to sunlight is somewhat analogous to the way that an egg white would turn from clear to white as it's being heated. In the case of a sunburn, it's not really just a matter of being heated. It's also changes that are happening because of the ultraviolet radiation coming from the sun. But what's similar is that there are proteins changing into other proteins as a result of this process of energy being deposited in them and causing chemical reactions. And so then you have these proteins that your immune system doesn't recognize as being on the list and goes after them. And so then a couple hours later, you're going to have inflammation and swelling. The next day, you might have skin peeling, things like that. Usually it doesn't turn into open sores or anything like that. Usually it's just a first-degree burn, maybe with some skin peeling. And like I said, this is a very normal human experience. It's fairly preventable because you can wear protective clothing or sunscreen that makes it much less likely that you'll get sunburned. But even so, most people experience these things. And so what do you do once that's happened? And a couple of things are really helpful. One is to put something cooling and anti-inflammatory directly on the burn. Aloe is a really popular thing for this. You can go and buy it in drugstores and whatever. I like to use fresh aloe. I buy the large aloe leaves from grocery stores and scrape the juice out of them. I also have aloe plants that I grow here in the clinic that I use for the same purposes. During the summertime, sometimes I'll be doing first aid for a festival and expect to see dozens and maybe even hundreds of people with sunburns. And so then I'll make up a big batch of what I call burn gel, where I will scrape the fresh juice out of the aloe leaves. Although you could buy store-bought aloe jelly for the same thing. Although a lot of the time that's just kind of has some thickeners and stuff in it, might not be as potent or as powerful. Real aloe, there are a lot of different varieties of aloe out there. Good burn aloe tastes bitter. If you have an aloe product that doesn't taste bitter, which some of them don't, some of them are grown for drinking, grown for their digestive promoting properties, and they don't have much of a bitter taste. But the stuff that's really good for burns, the stuff that's best for burns, has some bitterness to it. So I like using aloe for that. Often, if I'm know that I'm going to be treating burns, I will make up what I call burn gel, which is the aloe with vanilla extract. And I use about 8 ounces of aloe juice or gel, 8 ounces of the slime scraped out of aloe leaves, mixed with 1 ounce of organic vanilla extract. And the vanilla actually contains some burn specific pain relieving substances in it. Vanilla has a variety of different medicinal properties, but when it's applied topically, it's really useful for burns and for taking the pain out of burns. So a lot of the time, people, if they put that on as soon as they notice they have a sunburn, it will often make it so that the next day they can barely tell they have a sunburn. Keeps it from getting bad, because like I said, this is a process. This is an inflammatory process of the body responding to some incorrect proteins, and how intense that inflammatory process is determines how bad the burn itself is, how much pain, how much swelling, how much skin peeling, and all of that sort of thing that you end up getting. So that's one really good thing to know about when you're dealing with sunburns. Another thing is you can give anti-inflammatories internally. If, say, you don't get to it right away, the aloe is going to still help some, but it's not going to help nearly as much. Got a question here: do I make my own vanilla extract? Sometimes I do. I get vanilla beans and I soak them in 50% alcohol, but sometimes I buy the off-the-shelf Frontier organic vanilla extract that is in alcohol, not the non-alcohol one that's in glycerin, because it doesn't mix very well and it leaves a sticky residue on the skin if you use that. Don't use imitation vanilla extract. It doesn't have the medicinal properties at all. It's a different substance that just happens to smell similar. But the Frontier organic vanilla extract, it's not much more expensive, I don't think, than cheaper vanilla extract, and it has more vanilla in it. It tastes like it has a better quality or a larger amount of vanilla in it. So that's the kind that I use when I'm using store-bought. And vanilla doesn't grow around here. I haven't even had very much luck trying to grow it in a greenhouse. It can be done. Crone Conservatory up in Cincinnati has some lovely looking vanilla plants, but it doesn't grow around here, and I don't have like a really good familial source for it the way that I do for seaweed or anything. So it's something that I do tend to buy. Okay, let's see. There's a question that says, so I used vodka. Do I need to add water at some point? No, you don't need to add water to it. The vodka is probably about 40% alcohol and 60% water as it is. So you don't really need to add any more water to it. I would just use that and then add that to the aloe if I were going to use it. If you have a small burn, you can actually put the vanilla directly on it. Just like the kind of burn you would get if you were taking something out of the oven and your hand touched the pan, something like that. I wouldn't necessarily try straight vanilla all over your body. I don't know, it would get expensive pretty quickly. And also it's, I'm not sure what that would be like really. It is a little bit drying because it is an alcohol extract and then it's evaporating and it's taking water with it. But when you have it mixed with the aloe, that's not really the case so much anymore. So that's a good way to treat sunburn when it's new. And it helps some if it's not brand new. You know, if you notice the next day that you're terribly sunburned and you didn't realize you were going to be, you can still put aloe and vanilla on it. And it will help some, but it won't make it miraculously disappear usually, unless it was pretty mild to begin with. In that kind of case, most people find it to be a tolerable level of pain. Some people, especially children, can have a lot of pain from it and can actually even kind of feel sick from it and that sort of thing. So in those people, taking an anti-inflammatory like ginger internally, or a cooling remedy like spearmint internally will sometimes help with that. Either one of those things can be helpful. You can just have those in tea form, something like that. And that's usually all you need to do for sunburns. They usually are over with pretty quickly. Sometimes if somebody has a very serious sunburn, or it's over a very large amount of their body, sometimes I will use a stronger anti-inflammatory like Trillium. But that doesn't come up for me very much. It's something I have done a few times, but it's not something that I feel the need to do very much or have the occasion to do very much even. So yeah, that's a simple sort of skin issue that, like I said, is self-limiting and is generally not serious, and is something that you are likely to encounter in yourself or the people close to you at some point. Another thing that would fall into a similar category is poison ivy. Poison ivy is it's in the same family of plants as cashews. It has oils, oleoresins, which are sort of like oil, sort of like resin, on its leaves that gets on people's skin, and does something similar to what sunburns do. It actually causes some chemical changes in the skin, causes some irritation. Usually at that point, it makes people feel itchy, and the itching actually will cause damage to, and will cause what's called a neurodermatitis, where the skin is actually breaking out because it's being scratched. So you have both the breaking out from the scratching, and you have the breaking out from the urushiol, the oleoresins on the leaves as well. And if you're out in the sun makes it worse. There's another plant called rue that gives a similar type of rash that's actually mostly activated by the sun. If you get it on a part of your body that's not exposed to the sun, it usually won't break out. But if you get it on your hands, other parts that are out in the sun, it will break out. And it's very similar to poison ivy when it does. Rue doesn't grow around here very much. It's a garden plant that some people do grow, and it will persist for a while where it's planted, but it won't tend to, I haven't seen it anywhere in the United States become invasive or kind of continue growing and spreading on its own. It probably would in the right environment. It does in Europe, in England, and in Ireland, and probably other places as well. Let's see. Yeah, and rue has actually been used to treat shingles, which are they look similar to what a rue rash looks like. So that's an example of like treating like, or something treating a similar symptom to what it causes. So when you have this kind of contact dermatitis mixed with neurodermatitis that you get with poison ivy, the first thing you want to do if you know you've been exposed is to cleanse the area, wash it. Soap and water is really the best thing. There are things like wipes that contain petroleum-based solvents, like Technu. There are other things like hand sanitizer type things that are kind of wipes for wiping poison ivy off. And that can be okay until you get to the soap and water. But really your goal should be to wash that off with soap and water as soon as you possibly can, because it takes a while for the reaction to happen. And if you can wash it off before the reaction happens, that's better than any treatment. That's going to make you less likely to have a bad outbreak than any treatment you can possibly take. So I actually have a soap that I make for that, or I have something that I make for that called tincture of green soap, which is an old remedy. It's something that you could have bought in any drugstore in the early 1900s, I think. But it's a gentle plant-based soap dissolved in alcohol and water. So it's a tincture, and it contains the alcohol and it also contains the soap, and both of which help to solubilize the oleoresin and remove it from the skin with the help of water. So that's a useful remedy. And I think on my clinical herbalist YouTube page, I have something where I talk about how to make it. I can probably try and post a recipe for it in the comments, but the basic idea is to grate about half a cup of vegetable oil based soap and then add about half a cup of water to it. Let that sit until the soap and water kind of mix together into a sort of a mushy, soapy water type of thing. And then add 50% or so alcohol to it to make 2 cups of the finished product, and 16 ounces of the finished product. And depending on what oil is used to make the soap, it may or may not actually be green, but the name tincture of green soap is what it's usually referred to as. And like I said, that's an old remedy. It's been around for a long time. I make my own soap, so I use that to make it. So that's just really something I use. But if you don't have that, soap and water is good. Something like dish soap that's a little harsher might or might not help more to get the oleoresin off, the oils from the poison ivy off of your skin. And but it is also more drying. So, washing more thoroughly with a gentler soap might be just as good. For me, if I'm out in the woods, especially if I'm not just on a trail, but in the thickets and digging in the ground for roots and things like that, when I get home, I'll change out of my clothes and take a shower and wash any part of myself that might have come in contact with poison ivy, just on a precautionary basis. Even if I know I come in contact with poison ivy, I usually don't get a rash from it. But that's never a guarantee. Sometimes people will say, well, I'm not allergic to poison ivy. And the thing about not being allergic to poison ivy is that it's subject to change without notice. And some people will be not allergic to poison ivy for many years, and then all of a sudden they will be. And, they don't know that that's going to happen. So I just kind of, treat it with respect, treat it as though it could cause a problem, even though I don't usually expect it to. So in this case, cleansing is really the first line of prevention or treatment post-exposure for poison ivy. If somebody does get a rash breaking out on them, jewelweed is an herb that I use a lot. Sometimes I'll apply it if I know that I've been exposed after I've washed my hands. I'll crush up jewelweed and rub it on them, or use some jewelweed, put some jewelweed extract on my hands, like just a few drops of tincture, and rub it on. got a comment here that says, I made a jewelweed tincture spray. This is from Becca. It works pretty good. So yeah, tincture spray sounds like a great way to apply it. You know, you can get a small amount of it over a large amount of the body pretty easily. So jewelweed does a couple things when it comes to poison ivy. And one is that it's emollient, it's slippery, just kind of like aloe is, not as slimy as aloe. But if you crush up some jewelweed in your hands, after a few minutes, you'll start to feel the slippery sliminess of it. So it's got some of those same types of compounds that are soothing, softening to the skin. And in addition to that, it also contains some antihistamine compounds. It contains an orange substance, which I haven't gotten a chance to really analyze chemically, but I believe that it is a substance called lawsone, which is the same orange stuff that gives henna its pigment. But this is a bit of an antihistamine, or actually it's a pretty strong antihistamine. And there's a bit of it in the jewelweed. And that helps to prevent an allergic reaction. It kind of gets in the way of a chain reaction that leads to an allergic inflammatory response. So that can be a really useful thing to have on poison ivy rash, or an area that's been exposed to poison ivy that might develop into a rash. If somebody gets a full-blown rash, there are some other things that you can do. Lavender extract or essential oil sprayed on the skin can be helpful. If you have a lot of lavender, you can make a warm bath with some lavender infused in it, like basically put it in a sock or a bag or something like that, and kind of turn the whole bathtub into some lavender tea and then bathe in that. People also do the same thing with oatmeal. So a colloidal oatmeal bath, which is just where you have, colloidal just means you have very small bits of the stuff suspended in a liquid so that it makes the liquid look cloudy. That's really all a colloidal suspension is. So that's when I say colloidal oatmeal, it's just oatmeal, little tiny bits of oatmeal suspended in water. It's not really dissolved in the water. It's just sort of suspended in it in tiny, but not necessarily microscopic or atomic scale particles. So yeah, adding some oatmeal to the water, the idea there is that it's going to be moisturizing, soothing to the skin. If you use too much, or if the water is very hot, or even if somebody has just particularly dry skin, sometimes that can actually be drying rather than emollient. So it can kind of go either way. A lot of the time, so with a poison ivy, if you're giving somebody a bath to treat the poison ivy, to help with the poison ivy, you don't want it to be too hot because heat makes it more itchy. But lavender is really good as far as relieving the pain and itchiness. It's one of the better things out there. So that's cleaning off the skin, applying something that is anti-inflammatory like the lavender, applying something that is emollient and soothing like the jewelweed, or the colloidal oatmeal, to soften up the skin. If there's a lot of weeping, if there's a lot of like if somebody's scratched to the point where their skin feels hot and thick and leathery, and sometimes there will be little tiny blisters that are breaking open and leaking, at that point you probably want to use something astringent as well. Witch hazel might be a good choice for that. When you store-bought witch hazel is not very good. If you make your own witch hazel, it's brown. You put witch hazel bark in alcohol, soak it out, make a tincture. It's going to be brown, and it's going to have a strong ability to cause those weepy little blisters to close up and cause this fluid that's retained in the skin that's making it feel thick and leathery to be pushed back into the lymph system. The clear store-bought witch hazel which is made by distillation, probably doesn't really contain much other than alcohol and water. The substances that should make it work are mostly tannins, which are brown. If you don't have witch hazel, plain cold tea can also be helpful for this. Just black tea, but again, applied cool rather than hot. That can be helpful. Physically, ice can help with pain and itchiness some, just kind of keeping the area cool. Spraying it with lavender, either in the form of an essential oil dispersed through water, or tea made from lavender that's been allowed to cool, which will contain a lot more substances than the essential oil version of it would, is a good soothing thing that will have some astringency, have some anti-inflammatory properties as well, and also physically be cooling because you have the spray evaporating off of the skin. All right, and yeah, some people like when they have the blisters starting to form, some people like to scrub with something exfoliating. I've even heard of people using things like scouring pads or whatever. That kind of creeps me out a little bit. It does seem to sort of change the type of pain that they're feeling from an itch that's driving them crazy to just sort of a soreness that isn't itchy. But it's a pretty harsh thing to do. So I try to avoid getting to that point in the first place. Again, with this, anti-inflammatories taken internally can sometimes help with the pain being less, the itchiness being less, and so forth. So that's another approach that can be a helpful addition. Another thing that some people do in that sort of situation, if the skin's feeling very tight, itchy, that sort of thing, is seaweed bath, which you can make with any kind of seaweed. It could be kelp or sea moss, but allowing that to infuse into the water. It's salty, so it has some astringency to it. It'll tighten up wounds, keep them from getting infected or anything like that. Not that they would be at especially a high risk to, but in the sliminess of it also is going to soften the skin, make it feel less tight and overstretched as you're moving around and stuff like that. So that can be a helpful thing to do. Any or all of these can be helpful things to combine if somebody's got a bad case of poison ivy, because it can be really a miserable experience, even though it's generally not dangerous. It's very unlikely to progress into anything else, but it can be very maddening. It can make people feel, I've definitely heard many people say that a bad case of poison ivy was some of the worst that they've felt in their life, just because it's not the same sort of thing as a really severe pain. It's just an irritation that's so pervasive and so distracting that it really distresses people, really makes people feel like it's driving them out of their wits. So that's why there are so many extreme measures, like making a bath out of seaweed and or lavender that someone would bathe in, which is a lot of trouble to go to for something that's really going to go away on its own, even if you don't do anything. But in the meantime, it can feel really, really awful. That's great. So trying the aloe and vanilla in real time over at Gretchen's place, so that's good. Let us know how that goes. It usually is pretty helpful. let's see. Um, Becca is asking about an internal antihistamine that helps with poison ivy. So you can take a tincture of jewelweed internally, and I use it pretty often. Another thing that is sometimes helpful, which you're unlikely to hear about anywhere else, is shield lichens, which are just kind of the common lichens that can be found everywhere. They're in the genuses Parmelia and Parmatrema, which you can look up images of if you like. But these are the common lichens that you would see growing on wood or rocks in most places in the world. And if you make an extract out of them, it's orange and it's got some antihistamine and steroid properties to it, and anti-infective as well. So that is something that I have used quite a bit. There's another one called rock tripe that's not nearly as common and that I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying to go and harvest unless you're more familiar with the stand of it and how it grows and stuff like that. But the shield lichens are very common. They're not, they can be slow growing, but they are not very ecologically sensitive, and they're not rare or like very much concern ecologically, especially if you pick them off of branches that have fallen out of trees, in which case they're just going to, decompose anyway after the stick has started to decompose. And you'll find them more on some types of trees than others, but they're very common, generally speaking.
Andrew, I would just like to thank you because you had told me about the aloe and vanilla trick when my daughter had burned her hand on our wood stove, and she woke up the next morning and it was totally better. She did have some blistering, but they weren't sore. And she could use her hand and everything. She just had, some little white blisters, but it was totally pain-free. And she was like, I love Andrew. He fixed my hand. So thank you for that, by the way.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that. I'm so glad to hear that. And yeah, it usually works. I've used it a lot, for many years. I did first aid for a festival where people played with fire, and got to treat lots and lots of burns. And so that's something that usually works. And that I like a lot. And I find it to be fairly accessible because you can get aloe and vanilla in a lot of places. So even though neither one grows very much around here, they're still fairly accessible to people, even people that don't have, an herbalist or an herb shop or anything like that close by. So yes, so that's sunburns, poison ivy. There was a question, can you take jewelweed internally, tincture internally? And yes, you can. And I use it fairly often, much the same way that someone might use other antihistamine containing substances. So another really common, like I said, non-pathological skin eruption that people often encounter is acne. Acne is pretty different than these other two because it tends to be either very localized or a set of very localized points. So you can either have a pimple or an area where there are some pimples. Acne is mostly an inflammatory response. If you grew up in the 80s or before, you probably heard a lot about how it was more to do with bacteria, hygiene, not washing your face, things like that. That sort of thing can make it worse. But primarily at its heart, it is an inflammatory response. and the bacteria that are there are mostly along for the ride. They're just kind of not necessarily causing the sores. They might be keeping them open, but they're just kind of commensal. They're just sort of things that are in that environment because it's an environment that they can grow in, and not because they're necessarily creating it. So people who wash their face all the time and have excellent hygiene can still break out terribly. It is more to do with the production and secretion of fluids in your pores, and that is influenced by hormones. So, teenagers get a lot more acne. People who are, going through puberty or in their younger adult years tend to have more facial acne than anybody else. People who have high levels of testosterone will often get breakouts of acne on their back specifically. People who take anabolic steroids, or take testosterone or similar substances for whatever reason will often get breakouts of acne on their back. People can also get it under their chin or on their neckline. And those are some of the more common places to see it, and those are places where there's quite a bit of sebum, quite a bit of oily tissue. Oily secretions being produced by the tissue. So, hygiene is good. It's helpful. If anything that is like inflamed or irritated on your skin is going to be worse if the hygiene is worse, but it's not what causes the situation, in spite of there being long-standing advice and things like that suggest that it is. So with those types of breakouts, there are a couple of different things you might do, and they are the same types of things that you would do for the other conditions we talked about. So for instance, cleaning the area off is helpful. It's going to keep it's going to make it easier for the skin to heal up if there aren't other skin bacteria trying to make their way into the irritated area. Anti-inflammatories, you might or might not need anything that would be specifically for getting rid of the bacteria that are there. Like I said, they're mostly just along for the ride, probably not really doing a lot to cause the situation or to perpetuate the situation, but maybe some. So, and then astringents, which tighten up the pores. So the witch hazel that I mentioned before is good for that, for its astringency. It's also going to be somewhat antiseptic. The lavender or yarrow, you can make an extract out of yarrow and use that, and that will help quite a bit. It's going to be both strongly astringent and antiseptic. Oak bark, which we've talked about before, is a very strong astringent. If somebody has a lot of acne in one area, sometimes making a compress where you make an extract of the oak bark or a decoction of the oak bark, and soak a piece of cloth or a piece of paper towel or something in it, and then put it on the affected area and just leave it there for a few minutes. That can help to tighten up those pores, that will squeeze out the extra oil that's in the area. Picking at them, squeezing them, doing any kind of physical, mechanical irritation might reduce the fluid volume that's being retained in the tissue there, but it might also irritate them and make them re-inflame. So, for some people, they can't resist the temptation, and some of them say that it actually helps them to go away faster, but that's definitely not a thing that can be relied upon. Sometimes it will make it worse, and definitely picking at them makes them more likely to scar, which is something that a lot of people are really trying to avoid. When there is scarring, putting a little bit of castor oil on the area where the scar is can help to lighten that. There's also sometimes an extract of birch bark helps with that as well, just helping to lighten the discoloration or the change in color that happens with scarring. But that does tend to fade on its own for most people, even if they don't do that. The yarrow will help to prevent that from happening, to prevent scarring from happening in the first place if there is an area that's been picked open or something like that. Sorry if this is kind of a little bit of a gross topic, but you know, skin issues are like that. And then
Andrew,
soothing, yeah.
when you mention an extract of like yarrow or lavender, or what is that?
What kind
Like
of extract?
Yes.
It could be a tincture. It could be a strong tea. The important part is that you're getting the stuff from the herb into a liquid form. So either a tincture or a tea could be used for that. Tinctures tend to be a little more concentrated, but for the skin, the water-based stuff is actually a little better for you. Is a little better for not drying out the skin or causing pain or anything like that. So the ideal thing would be to make a really strong tea. In the case of oak bark, a really strong decoction, or in the case of lavender, a really concentrated infusion, and use that. But you know, you could do it with a tincture as well. The trouble with the non-tincture part is that it doesn't keep, right? So you can, you know, perhaps use a fifth as much of the herb as you were using of water and make a really strong tea that would be concentrated as a tincture, but then, you know, it wouldn't keep for very long. So it just kind of depends on how you want to do that. Whether your priority is to be able to keep it for longer or for it to be a little less drying and harsh on the skin.
Just applying that, say with like a cotton pad a couple of times a day, after washing or something. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I usually wouldn't just apply it directly and wipe it off, but like let it sit for a while, for a few minutes, rather than just, you know, applying it and then, you know, immediately, but just like using it as more like a compress, where you have the pad or the cloth or the piece of paper towel or whatever that's soaked in it, and then letting it sit there for a few minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah. So if yeah, so those are, and then after you've done all of that, something soothing on the skin can also help. The castor oil is a little more of an extreme thing, but you could also use something like, I mean, there are a lot of lotions and face serums and things like that that are made for this purpose. But if you wanted to use something a little simpler, something like a couple drops of marshmallow tincture, or, you know, infusion could work too. Can be a really good thing for the skin. Rose water, which is just kind of water that's well, it's basically like a tea of rose petals. It's kind of often it's produced in the course of making rose oil, but it doesn't have to be. But just water that's infused with rose petals is a really good traditional thing that is both astringent and soothing for the skin. And that's something that's has a long history of use. It does tend to smell like roses, but that can be a different smell depending on what kind of roses are involved. But if you have rose petals, that's a good thing to use. But don't buy roses that are grown ornamentally and make medicine out of them, because they're sprayed with things that might not be intended to ever come in contact with human consumption of any sort. So I wouldn't trust them to be medicinal grade, basically, since they weren't grown with that sort of thing in mind. Yeah, there are a lot of different products out there that are for the skin that contain either some aromatic compounds, astringents, and emollients. So aromatic compounds would be things like essential oil, but also some herbal extracts. And then the emollient compounds would be things like kelp, sea moss, colloidal oatmeal, aloe, and astringents can include a lot of things like the witch hazel, like the rose petals that firm up the skin. And you can combine these things, they don't have to each be applied separately and discreetly. You can combine these things into your own formulas and products if you want, and make some good things for the skin. So acne is a pretty common thing that most people experience. Another common thing that a lot of people experience is tinea. Tinea is not a specific pathogen. It is more like a type of rash or a type of skin outbreak that comes from fungal infection. Ringworm is what you would call it when it's on the body, but it can be, if it's on the feet, it's athlete's foot. If it's in the groin, it's jock itch. If it's it can be on the hands sometimes too, especially if somebody is doing something like washing dishes, where their hands are damp and hot all the time. It can be in the scalp or in the beard area in some people, and that can be really hard and not fun to treat when it's in those areas, because trying to get to the skin through the hair, adds a bit of an additional challenge. So when you have that situation, it's a fungal infection. For most people, it's not really something that can turn into anything really serious, except in an extremely immune compromised person. Even like a normal immune compromised person, it's going to be harder to get rid of, but it's not going to turn into anything much more serious usually. But it can cause itching, burning, cracking of the skin, stuff like that, and it can be pretty unpleasant. When it's on the body, the ringworm, it can look like the name is kind of confusing because it has the word worm in it, but there are no actual worms involved. Sometimes it looks just like a red disc, but sometimes it's a ring of reddish or red with yellow crustiness, or just kind of maybe just crusty raised skin with a center of just normal looking skin. Then that's why it's like a ring. When it gets in your scalp, it's still called ringworm, but there's no ring involved or any worm involved either. It's just like yellow crustiness and itchiness on the scalp. And that's really gross. And I'm sorry to, maybe make anybody feel uncomfortable by talking about something that's kind of like that. But that's kind of how these sorts of things are sometimes. So with any of these, the first thing you want to do is wash the area, and then you want to try and reduce the amount of dampness and heat that the area is exposed to. So being dry and cool will often get rid of these things. One case that I like to talk about is somebody who got some foot fungus when they were in Vietnam. They were in the jungle wearing boots for basically a couple years, and they got really bad athlete's foot and toenail fungus. And they treated it with all sorts of things over the course of decades, and it would go mostly away, but it would never completely go away. And then when they retired and started wearing flip-flops more and not wearing tight, pinchy dress shoes and just wearing, either loose-fitting sneakers or else flip-flops or something like that, it went away within a few months. And some of that might have been the stress, but I think a lot of it was just the foot hygiene, the fact that their feet were not damp and sweaty all the time because they weren't wearing that kind of shoes anymore. And so it took an extreme situation to cause it to get as bad as it did, but then it was a fairly normal situation that perpetuated it for decades, for over 20 years. And then after they retired, it essentially resolved on its own. So I think that's, an interesting thing to keep in mind, that fungal infections are a manifestation of damp heat. So if you don't have the dampness and heat that it thrives on, it tends to go away. In addition to trying to keep the areas from being damp and hot, which can be hard to do if your job is a dishwasher, or if your job involves, wearing shoes that don't fit very well or whatever. If it's an occupational exposure type of thing, it might be hard to work around, but you can do things like treating the area with antifungals that helps to get rid of it. And whenever I have somebody that has a fungal infection on their skin, I do two things. One of which is to put a topical antifungal on it, sesame oil being like the most basic thing that I use. Sesame oil, just plain, without doing anything to it, it's a pretty decent antifungal. And it can be put anywhere on the body. It's, completely non-toxic. Hardly anyone is allergic to it or anything like that. So that's a really good first thing to try topically. And then I like to do something internal as well. The thing that I usually use when somebody comes to see me in the clinic is an herb called ferula. Ferula is kind of garlicky. Asafoetida is another name for it. It's sap from a plant in the celery family. So that's something that people take internally. It comes out through their sweat and tends to kill off funguses. If you don't have that, garlic will do the same thing. It's a little bit harsher. There's cinnamon as well. I make a tincture out of cinnamon. They're used for a lot of different things, but it's an antifungal. It can be taken internally, and it will also come out in the sweat some, so that when people are sweating, the dampness and the heat is also somewhat antifungal as well. So, kind of trying to make it so that the situations that create or perpetuate the fungus aren't as beneficial to it. You can add sandalwood, which you can get, usually you can find it in the form of essential oil more than you can find it in the form of the actual wood itself. But either way, if you wanted to make sandalwood infused sesame oil or add a few drops of sandalwood essential oil to some sesame oil, that's that's something you can do to enhance its antifungal effects. It also has a very strong incense type smell to it that some people might really like, and some people might feel like is too perfumey for them, depending on their personal preferences. But that's a very gentle and very strong antifungal thing that usually doesn't cause irritation to the skin. A lot of people want to use tea tree oil because tea tree oil is antifungal, but if you just sprinkle tea tree oil directly on an area that has ringworm, it might work, but it's going to evaporate really quickly, and then it's going to be gone. And if it doesn't work fast enough, then if it doesn't penetrate the skin fast enough and get to where all the fungus is, then it's going to lose its chance to work. So mixing that with sesame oil will actually slow that evaporation down. But it is a little bit harsher on the skin compared to the sandalwood oil. It's a little more likely to burn. It's a little more likely to dry out the skin. So those are some things you can do. All of that is about getting rid of the fungus that is kind of causing or perpetuating the skin irritation. And then after you've done that, there'll usually be the skin might be discolored, and you just kind of have to wait for that to go away. It might also be itchy or sore, you know, even after the actual fungus is gone. And just putting sesame oil on it and brushing it with a body brush can help to make that go away faster, make it return to a normal skin texture faster. And then using soothing herbs, emollient herbs, is another thing that can be helpful for that as well. If it's painful, using anti-inflammatories can be helpful. A lot of the time it's really not that painful. Sometimes it's itchy, and you can use jewelweed on it as well in that situation. So, you know, again, you know, with pretty much everything, the same set of strategies of cleansing, using anti-inflammatories, using emollient, soothing herbs. So, you know, very, very similar. And then, you know, getting rid of infection if there is infection. Another example of this sort of thing might be cold sores, which are just tiny little blisters. They break open. Sometimes they bleed. I like usnea oil for them because it's got the sort of skin soothing properties of this oil, which again, sesame oil is a good thing to use as a base. But if you cook some usnea lichen in that, it's going to actually give it some pain relieving and perhaps antiviral properties as well, so that when it's put on a sore, it's going to help it to not hurt, and it's going to help it to not crack and break as that skin moves, and soothe it and reduce inflammation. Another thing that we sometimes see as a skin issue is impetigo, which is similar to the ringworm situation, but it's bacterial. It's actually staph infection. So cleansing it is the most important part. Cleaning it, if it gets very advanced, it can actually become a dangerous situation with impetigo. So it's kind of on the borderline between being a non-serious self-limiting condition and being something that could actually turn into something worse. If there's open sores with it, it's more of an issue. If it's just kind of like thick and rashy looking skin, then it's more likely to just be a self-limiting type of thing. But cleaning it with soap, water, very frequently, multiple times a day is a good idea. And then treating it with herbs that have some antibacterial properties can be good. The golden seal that we talked about last week is a perfectly appropriate thing in that type of situation. It does stain the skin a little bit, but it's really good for killing that particular bacteria when it comes in direct contact with it. And then using softening things on the skin, whether it's marshmallow, slippery elm, colloidal oatmeal, seaweed, anything slimy, you know, it's just rubbing that into the skin. With that, because it is a bacterial infection, you don't want to be rubbing the skin with other parts of your skin. You want to use gloves or some kind of applicator, some kind of pad or cloth or whatever that you then get rid of. In some people, that infection can turn sort of flesh eating and cause open sores and things like that. Most of the time, it's more of a problem when it gets into an open wound, rather than just when it's on the skin causing a skin issue. But that's impetigo, otherwise known as staph infection. It's a very, very common thing to see on the skin. And like I said, a lot of the time it's really a non-serious, self-limiting type of situation, although it isn't always. And, so if it's getting worse, even though you're treating it, then you probably need to get some outside help, and not let it get very advanced or anything. What does impetigo look like? Usually it's just sort of like red, shiny, stretched looking area of the skin. A lot of the time it's on the hands. Sometimes it's on the feet too. You see it more in little kids than in adults. Sometimes it can develop into little sores that look maybe like a small cigarette burn or something like that. And that's it's bad if it does that, but usually it doesn't get that bad. And, it is more often a hygiene issue that leads to it in the first place. Let's see. As there was a question about how to make rose water last longer or be more shelf stable. So the only real way that I know of to do that is to add something preservative to it. Alcohol is one example of something you could use for that. You can also add something like myrrh, a little bit of myrrh to it, although that might change the texture of it. And then you can also refrigerate it, and that will make it last longer. You can freeze it too. But for the most part, I do think of it as a sort of a fresh product and something that you if you want the best results from it, you kind of have to use it soon. There are lots of commercial products though that have, commercial preservatives in them that last for a while at room temperature. I'm not sure how long they keep, but yeah, a lot of the time, if I were going to try and make it shelf stable, like if I wanted it for something long term and wanted it to be shelf stable, I would probably just use alcohol to preserve it. And probably I would make it with alcohol in the first place rather than trying to dilute it with alcohol. So I wanted to talk about a couple different herbs today, and the first one I want to talk about is eutrochium, or queen of the meadow, also known as gravel root. There are a bunch of different herbs that are kind of collectively known as Joe Pye weeds that are just in the members of this genus called eutrochium. A lot of them grow in meadows and fields. One of them that tends to grow more in forests and openings in the forests is eutrochium purpureum, which is what people would call the real gravel root, the true gravel root. It's maybe the more well, I would say it's the more commercially used product, but really I'm not sure that that's actually true. But if you see something that is a eutrochium in commerce, it's almost always going to be labeled as eutrochium purpureum, whether it really is or not. Anyway, there's multiple plants in this genus and they have similar medicinal properties. And the root of this plant is a really good plant, a really good herbal remedy for kidney stones and gallstones. So it's a very fluid moving kind of plant. Both of the plants we're going to talk about today, this applies to, they help move fluids in the body. So in the case of this one, of gravel root, it stimulates both the liver and the kidneys. And because the liver and the kidneys are both organs of filtration in the body and remove waste products from the body, it can actually make people feel better from a wide variety of situations. But most especially, it has a history of being used for stones. which can include gallstones too, although there are other things that maybe are stronger for that, but also kidney stones. It helps to break them up and it helps them to get flushed out. So it's a pretty useful herb in those situations, and those situations can be really alarming, really unpleasant, terrible feeling types of situations that sometimes there isn't that much to do about. I mean, with gallstones, they can take out somebody's gallbladder. With kidney stones, sometimes it's just a matter of waiting for it to pass, and it's a really unpleasant process. But either of those situations, you know, it's kind of better if you don't, if you're able to relieve the symptoms and able to relieve the process without it being a long, drawn out and painful thing, that's something that people will be really grateful for. So let me see if I have some content to share on this. Let's go back a little further than I thought I was going to have to. No, I thought I had a picture of it, but I don't seem to. But it's a tall plant with a sort of wide cluster of little purplish pink flowers, and you know, so sometimes the plant is 8 or 10 feet tall. The root is aromatic, and it's kind of like has a horizontal portion with lots of little rootlets coming down off of it. So it's a very common plant in Kentucky, especially in the late summer. You can find great abundance of it, and it is a useful plant to have in your home apothecary or clinic or whatever you end up having for these types of situations. And although those are the stones are dramatic situations in which you need it, but it is also a good diuretic for helping to flush out the kidneys if there's kidney infection, bladder infection type situations, and it does promote digestion as well. Yeah, Joe Pye weed is another name for it. Joe Pye was supposedly a Native American physician or herbalist. I don't really know the details on him, though. I've heard about this character from a few people, but you know, maybe they have more the nature of a legend or a folk tale or something, because it's not real clear as to when they lived or anything like that. But supposedly this was the name of someone who introduced this herb to English speaking people, and it became pretty popular at one point, and is, you know, remains widely used up to this time as far as herbal remedies go. And so it does promote digestion a little bit, and movement of the fluids from the liver, which can help with digestion and detoxification of the body in general. The other herb that I wanted to talk about today is called prickly ash. Prickly ash is not actually an ash tree at all. In fact, which it shares in common with mountain ash, which is also not an ash tree. And the two of them are not related to each other, but not closely anyway. Prickly ash is a tree with sort of warty bark, and It does grow here in Kentucky, but it's not super common. Often it'll grow along the edges of fields or in not very thick woods. And it has, this warty bark and a sort of yellowish color to its wood. The bark is the main part of the plant that's used medicinally. If you have small twigs and you chop them up, the wood actually has some of the properties too. There are a couple different species here in the United States, and there's another species in China. And they're all used fairly similarly medicinally. And just like the Joe Pye weed, it helps to move fluids in the body. So with this one in particular, it has a really unique flavor to it. I don't quite know how to describe it. It's a little bit spicy, and it promotes a lot of salivation. So if you chew on the bark, it will really make your mouth fill with saliva, and it has a warm, spicy flavor to it. The fruits of the Chinese species are called Szechuan peppercorns because they're spicy like peppercorns, but they're not actually, not closely related at all to actual peppercorns. But the bark is, like I said, the usual part to use medicinally. And it's not as hot as ginger or cayenne, but it is spicy. It's not as hot as black pepper either, but it is spicy. And it really helps to move fluid all over the body, starting with your mouth when you first put it in your mouth. And, it's very pronounced. And if you take small amounts of it internally, it will help move digestion. At slightly larger amounts, it will kind of warm up your body. It will help joints. If somebody's retaining lymph in their lower extremities, it will help move that too. So if somebody's got lots of swelling from their calves to their feet, often with the skin getting sort of thick and crackly looking, that's a situation where I would very frequently have them take prickly ash. And a lot of the time it will really help to move that excess fluid out of their body, which at first might cause some alarming frequency and urgency with urination and diarrhea. But it's really just that this fluid is being moved out of places where it shouldn't have been and expelled from the body. And that can make a big difference to people's quality of life if they do have a lot of this lymph retention and swelling, because it can make it hard to walk around and stuff. So it's really useful for that. It's useful, just like ginger is, for joint pain, lower back pain, a variety of different things that are made worse by the cold, like muscle cramping, any kind of pain that's chronic pain that's made worse by the cold, which often people will find that old injuries, like if somebody, hurt their knee or their ankle at some point in the past, sometimes it'll bother them when it's cold, or bother them a lot worse when it's cold. And prickly ash is really helpful in that situation. If it's used topically, it can be used in small amounts on wounds and it will make them drain. You can put it on a pad or something like that and put it over a wound, and it will cause the wound to drain if there's drainage that needs to happen. So it can be useful in that situation. If somebody has, even with acne or something like that, a single drop of it can often cause that to tighten up and force out the fluid that doesn't need to be there if there's fluid that's retained in the pores and stuff. So it's a useful herb in that sort of situation as well. And because it's a tree, you have to think about that when you're harvesting it. Usually when I find a stand of prickly ash, it's like 4 or 5 trees growing together out in the woods somewhere. I don't ever like to take a whole tree of prickly ash in this environment. There are other places where it grows much more thickly, and it would be fine to take a small tree. And when I say trees, these trees are often like this big around. They're often very small trees. I call them trees rather than bushes because of the shape of them. You know, they have a trunk and then they spread out up above the trunk rather than just being like a shrub on the ground. But they're very small usually. They don't have to be, but they usually are. So usually I'll cut off a branch, a small branch, and peel that, and maybe chop up the twigs into small pieces, and then make a tincture out of that whole thing. And that's it's a useful remedy. It's stimulating to salivation. So if somebody has a dry mouth, taking a drop of that and putting it under their tongue will often make them not have a dry mouth for hours, maybe even all day. In older people that have lost their appetite, I'll often use that, sometimes in combination with chamomile, to help them have more of an appetite and have an easier time eating food. And that can be a really pleasant thing, a really positive change for people, because it allows them to enjoy eating food again. It has a long history of use for tooth pain. So if somebody has pain in their teeth, it will help with that sometimes. I have other things that I use for that too, so I don't use it as much, but it's kind of like, I would say that in the traditional medicine of Eastern Kentucky, it's sort of one of the 2 standard remedies for toothache, the other one being just holding whiskey on it until it goes numb. But it's really useful as a toothache remedy, and it's really useful for dry mouth. So it's a good medicine for the mouth, generally speaking. And then for the digestive system and for circulating the fluids anywhere in the body. All right. Any question about either of those? It's a question of how do I understand the mechanism of action of prickly ash as far as the physiology goes. So as far as I know, the phytochemistry of it, the pharmacology of it is not real well elucidated, but I understand it to be something that is spicy and opens up the circulation, like ginger, and for it to be a sialagogue like echinacea or maybe, well, some other ones as well, but that it has that tingly mouth feeling that produces a lot of salivation. So that's kind of the main things that I think of as far as it. I don't think of it as much as being an anti-inflammatory. It is a bit of an anti-inflammatory, but I mostly think of it in terms of it being warming and increasing the movement of fluids because of its spiciness. And that spiciness, usually spiciness, when you encounter it in the body, physiologically what's going on is that there's a chemical reaction, an enzymatic reaction that's causing physiological processes to happen that would normally happen at a higher temperature. So you usually have things in your body that perceive heat, and sometimes enzymes from plants or other things can cause them to act as though there were heat when there is not physically any heat, sometimes by maybe making an ion channel open up, or making basically a neuron fire that would normally fire at a higher temperature. So your body is interpreting this as warmth. It's interpreting it as heat, and opening up the blood vessels, which is a cooling response. At least, something your body would do to try and cool itself off is to open up the blood vessels and increase the flow of liquid. And so it's doing that, and it's causing that flowing of liquid to happen by feeling hot to your body. But it's not as overstimulating as cayenne is. It's not like as harsh or as intense. So, yeah. And then with the eutrochium, physiologically, I think that it is mostly working because it contains alkaloids that are getting into the digestion and causing the liver to try and flush them out, and then getting into the kidneys and causing the kidneys to try and pass more fluid through to try and wash those bitter substances, those alkaloids out, and that's taking the stones and things like that along with it. So, yeah. So, I haven't seen anybody's plant collections yet. Hopefully I get a chance to. I would love to take a look at some of those with everybody. And also, it's a good time to be thinking about what you want to be doing for your final project. I know that I've said all of this stuff before, but just to emphasize. And of course, I know that right now we've got holidays coming up and things like that that can interfere with all that. And there's really no hard and fast time limit on any of this. But as far as the plant collections go, there's not a whole lot more plants to collect during the winter time. Although, if you go out this time of year, if you look at garden beds that haven't had anything done to them for a few months, you'll often see a certain set of plants growing there. Maybe not flowering, but maybe sometimes flowering, but a certain set of weeds that are starting to grow in disturbed ground in places near you as winter comes on. And it's good to see that process happening. That's just something in the natural world that you can look at that's going on right now, besides just the leaf fall and trees going into dormancy. You can see the winter annuals starting to grow, which here in Kentucky, this would include lamium, which is dead nettle and henbit, as well as some, depending where you are, sometimes groundsel, which is a senecio species, dandelions, wintercress, some things like that that would be growing in abandoned garden beds, or garden beds that have been kind of let to sit for the winter, and maybe in other disturbed ground, like places where the ground was dug up for whatever reason and then left to its own devices. You'll often see this set of plants right now, and what they're doing is they're putting out their leaves as the tree canopy is thinned out. They're putting out their leaves and collecting that sunlight that's finally making it onto the ground, and they're going to keep doing that all winter long, and then flower towards the end of winter and put out seeds at the very beginning of spring. Oh, wild lettuce. Yeah, that's interesting. There's a lot of wild onions right now too, that would be coming up in different places, and they mostly reproduce vegetatively rather than going to seed. They grow, and then at the top of the stem, they produce a bunch of little bulbs, which then fall to the ground and grow into new plants. But you'll see a lot of wild onions, onion grass type stuff growing in unmowed lawns and things like that right now, or also garden beds. And that is it's a member of the onion genus, and it can be used just like garlic or onions in cooking. So there's a lot still going on in the natural world. Here in Kentucky, there is something going on with plants all of the time. One thing that I have been posting about on social media, on Instagram especially, is persimmons. Persimmons are ripe right now. Some persimmon trees have dropped all their fruit, and some persimmon trees haven't yet. But this is the season for them right now, and getting towards the end of that season. They start getting ripe in October, and by the middle of November, they're usually pretty much done. But that's a wild fruit that is available with some degree of abundance around this time of year. If you are so fortunate to live near a persimmon tree or a stand of persimmon trees. And they're culturally significant wild food that people who have lived in this area have always used. It's kind of it's the last sweet berry of the year. And so they're out there right now. What? Yeah, they're really striking looking too, because they're like these orange globes. Yeah, if you haven't seen the videos that I've put on them, my Instagram's Clinical Herbalist, so easy to remember. And I've got a few videos about them on there. And I'll probably string those together into one long video and put it on the YouTube channel at some point, but I may or may not get around to that. It can prevent what that happen with sunburns? I'm not sure I understand this question. Oh, okay. So yeah, as far as preventing that's part of what I talked about with like the substances getting changed by the infrared light. And there's really, that happens while the skin is being irradiated. So there's not really anything to prevent it once the exposure has happened. But you can, if you're trying to not get like sun poisoned, which some people get, like an actual sick feeling after having been exposed to too much sun. Hydration is really important, and then the kidneys are responsible for getting that sort of stuff out of the body. So fluids and things that stimulate the kidneys, herbs that stimulate the kidneys, would be helpful for that. Something gentle like cranberry might be helpful in that situation, or corn silk, rather than a more intense type of thing. But yeah, once the exposure has happened, you really can't prevent that. You can only try to get it to clear away as soon as possible.
Andrew, I have a question about our project, actually.
Yeah.
So I know we need to include like the name and all that stuff. What else are you wanting us to include information wise with each specimen?
With the plant collection, I want you to include the common name, the Latin binomial, and anything you know about it medicinally, and also, if possible, where you found it. But the main thing is, being able to recognize the plant and know what it is. being able to identify it. And but yeah, anything you know about the medicinal properties or other properties of it would be a good thing to include. And where and when it was harvested, if you have that information.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm
Yeah.
still working on mine, I promise.
Great. I'm glad to hear it. Yeah. So, yeah. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about different situations like this that would be common things for you to see in your own practice. And then we'll probably talk some more about some more advanced types of medicine making after that, some more complicated types of medicine making. And I think that you're kind of probably noticing that you're getting to the point where you have quite a few herbs under your belt that you're familiar with or have studied at this point, and probably quite a few situations in real life that you at least have some idea what to do about. So, you're getting hopefully to the point where you're gaining some confidence and some competence and some ability to do stuff with plants for health. And that can be a really exciting feeling. And I think that, if anybody is working on a particular case, if you're trying to help somebody, and some of you have done this already, if you're trying to help somebody close to you and you want some advice or have some questions about the particulars, feel free to reach out. And I would love to talk to any of you about that type of situation. All right. Well, that is about all that I have to say for this time. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to let me know. And thank you all for coming. I'll talk to you next Tuesday. Yes, good night.